Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about the three kinds of chemical bonds that you're going to be responsible for on your exam. The first kind is the ionic bonds, which we'll talk about in a second. We have covalent bonds, which is the second type. There are two kinds of covalent bonds. We have nonpolar covalent and polar covalent. And the third type is hydrogen bonds. So if we're talking about an ionic bond, what does that mean? We have a complete transfer of electrons. The best example is the one that we did in class, and that's in your textbook, and that's table salt, which is sodium chloride. These charges up here at the top, right here and here, indicate that sodium has completely given up an electron, so now it has a positive charge, and chlorine accepted the electron, and now there's a negative charge. You would never see the superscript of charges unless it's an ionic bond, complete transfer. When you do have these different charges on these atoms or elements, we call them ions. More specifically, if it's a positively charged ion, as in the case of sodium, we call it a cation. If we have a negatively charged ion, we call it an anion. So all cations are electron donors. So sodium gave an electron to chlorine. And all anions are electron acceptors because they're going to accept the electrons. So again, when we're talking about ionic bonds, we're completely transferring electrons from one atom to another atom. Covalent bonds, we don't transfer electrons. What we want to do is we share our electrons. Because we're sharing our electrons, we don't have these charges as a superscript at all. So a nonpolar covalent bond would be something like methane, which is CH4. And you've probably seen methane also drawn like this. The dashes between the carbon and the hydrogen here, that dash is representing one pair of electrons being shared. If we talk about something like molecular oxygen, we would draw it like this. This is called a double bond. This means that two electrons are being equally shared. So anytime you see these straight lines, it's telling you that it's a covalent bond and that the electrons are being shared equally. The second kind of covalent bonds is so this is shared equally. Is a polar covalent bond, and this is where the electrons are not shared equally. One of the atoms in the molecule is going to be pulling harder on the electrons than the other one. So water is a great example. So water is H2O, so I'm drawing the oxygen and I'm drawing the two hydrogens here. We still are drawing the straight line because we're sharing electrons. However, because they're not shared equally, we have to do something else to it. We have to add our partial positive and partial negative charges. Not complete charges like up here because it's not an ionic bond. We're still sharing, they're just not shared equally. So how do we determine which element's going to be pulling on the electrons more? You can look at a periodic table. So if this is your periodic table, going to the right on it and going up means that you have a higher electronegativity. So if we were to look at a periodic table, which I don't have up, so I'm just going to tell you, oxygen has a higher electronegativity, meaning that it's going to bear, and this little symbol just means partial, the partial negative charge. It's going to pull on those electrons harder. So if I were to draw the electrons would be closer to there, to the oxygen atom, then closer to the hydrogen atom. Same thing here. Electrons pulling on them harder, so they're a little bit closer in the bond to oxygen than hydrogen. Because oxygen's pulling on them a little harder, they get the partial negative charge on the oxygen atom. That means that hydrogen gets a partial positive charge, because it's not completely giving up the electrons, but it's also has less pull or effect from the electrons because they're farther away from these atoms. So polar covalent bonds, they're not shared equally, and we get these partial positive, partial negative charges, but again, not the complete charges like up here for ionic bonds, because we're not completely transferring or accepting electrons. What happens is, because we get these partial positives and partial negatives, even though they're not complete charges, they are still attracted to each other. So partial positives are going to be attracted to partial negatives. So a hydrogen atom in water is going to be attracted to an oxygen in another water molecule that has a partial negative. So I'll draw oxygen here. Remember, the straight line means that we're formed a complete bond within one molecule. So water is H2O, so we have bonds between our oxygen and our hydrogen, and between our oxygen and our other hydrogen over here. When we talk about these attraction between the partial positive and the partial negative charges, these are a little bit different because they're not true bonds. They're hydrogen bonds. And this is what we talked about when we talked about macromolecules like proteins. When we fold a protein, how we fold it is because we have these attractions between these partial and negative charges in the amino acids, and they form hydrogen bonds. The formation of the hydrogen bonds allows them to take a 3D structure. Same thing when we talk about two strands of DNA. Some of the nucleotides will be have partial positive and negative charges that are attracted to partial positive and negative charges on the other strand of DNA. Because of their attraction, they form a DNA double helix, forming hydrogen bonds between the nitrogenous bases, which we talked about. So like the hydrogen bonds I'm talking about, that's similar to the ones going on between these two water molecules. Or if we said adenine, I'm drawing a mustache now because now you know they're hydrogen bonds. To thymine forms two hydrogen bonds, and then guanine or uracil, two. And we have three hydrogen bonds formed here. Cytosine. These are hydrogen bonds. Not true bonds. They're easily broken by things like heat or changes in pH, but they are still considered a weak type of bond. So, and again, these are created because we have the partial positive and partial negative charges, and they're created between two different molecules. So here's one molecule of water and another water molecule, not within the water molecule itself, or the H2O or molecule itself, would we create hydrogen bonds. They are attractions between two different types of molecules. So that is going to explain what the hydrogen bond is. So we can't have hydrogen bonds unless we have polar covalent molecules, because remember, polar covalent ones are going to have the partial positive and partial negatives. If we have a whole cup full of non-polar covalent molecules, they're not going to have partial positives or partial negatives because they're shared equally, which means they're not going to be able to form hydrogen bonds. So we can only form hydrogen bonds if we have polar covalent bonds. And that's all you really need to know as far as three types of chemical bonds.